behavioral scientists are routinely publishing these papers where they make broad, sweeping claims about human nature. Most of this research is based exclusively on samples, that's groups of people, drawn from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries, that is, weird societies. Not only are they drawn from weird societies, but they're drawn from a very small segment of weird societies, undergraduates at research universities. And so the people who are being studied, who are standing in as representatives of human nature as such, are undergraduates who are at universities conducting this research. So why undergraduates at universities? Because that's who social scientists and behavioral scientists typically use when they need study participants. Does that radically skew our perspective of human nature? That's the question that the authors of this study are raising. Much of the research assumes that it doesn't. Much of the research assumes that these standard subjects are representative of our entire species. Are they? So the paper reviews this enormous comparative database, and they find that weird subjects, people from Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic countries, weird subjects are in fact quite weird in the typical sense of the word weird. They are very unusual when compared to the rest of our species. So what you have in a lot of behavioral science is a subset, a very narrow, peculiar subset of the species, masquerading as an objective picture of human nature. But it's not just because the research community is really homogeneous, which it still, unfortunately, is more homogeneous than it ought to be in an ideal world. But it's also that the populations that are being studied are extremely homogeneous in a problematic way. Okay, so let's really quickly consider one of the examples that they look at. So this is the so-called Mueller-Lyer illusion. And for a long time, psychologists and cognitive scientists thought that this was a fundamental perceptual illusion that all human minds were subject to. So take a look at these two lines, line A and line B. Which one of them is longer? If you're like most folks from weird societies, you look at these two lines and you think that line B is longer. But if you took a ruler out and you measured them on your screen, you would see that the black lines are actually the exact same length. But there's something about the way the arrows, the direction in which the arrows are drawn, that throws our minds off if we're from a weird society. But here's another interesting fact about the findings. So at one end of the spectrum, you have American undergraduate students. And those students, on average, require line A to be about 20% longer than line B before they perceive the two as being about the same length. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, the San foragers of the Kalahari are completely unaffected by this so-called illusion. In fact, to them, it's not an illusion at all. They see the black lines and they say, yeah, they're exactly the same length. And then, like I said, it's a spectrum. Between the American undergraduates and the foragers of the Kalahari, you have a diverse array of responses to this so-called optical illusion. So what's the point? The point is that for a long time, cognitive scientists and psychologists thought this is a fundamental perceptual illusion that we're all subject to in virtue of having the kind of mind that we have. And what this finding suggests is that that's not true at all, that this is actually a kind of cultural byproduct. Okay, so why does this happen to us? So if you're from a weird society, why is it that these two lines, even though they're exactly the same length, they look to be a different length? Well, the theory is sometimes referred to as the theory about the Carpentered World. And the idea is, if you grow up in a weird society, you grow up in buildings that have carpentered corners. And if you'll notice, this line here, the one that appears shorter to us, it looks like this line, right? You see how the lines go down there? And then this line here, which appears longer to us, it's shaped like this line, right? So the line of the carpentered corner, when it's further away from us, the lines go up from it. And when it's closer to us, the lines go down on the side. And so the idea here is your mind knows that this wall here is the exact same length, the exact same height as this wall here. But this wall is closer to you, and that's why it appears longer. So, when your mind sees these lines, even though they're exactly the same length, your mind assumes that this one is longer because this one would be the one that was down here in the hall, far away from you. And if it's the same length as this one, you know that it's actually much longer because, right, the distance it is away from you would make it appear shorter. So the Mueller-Lyer illusion on this account is a kind of culturally evolved byproduct. It's not a core constitutive feature of human perception in general. It's something that we pick up in the course of our normal development. Here's another example. This is the Ebbinghaus illusion. So take a look at the two orange circles, the two orange spheres. Which one is bigger? If you're like most weird people, you're going to say that the orange circle on the right appears bigger. You might know that it's the same size, but it appears bigger. And the truth of the matter is that the orange spheres are exactly the same size. The one on the right just appears bigger because it's encircled by smaller circles, whereas the one on the left appears smaller because it's encircled by those very large circles. So here's the thing. When weird people look at this, they see it as an illusion. They get it wrong. But when people from remote villages look at these images, they get it right. They look at them and they say, oh yeah, the orange circles are exactly the same size. And the hypothesis that explains this is that people from remote villages rely less on the holistic context when they're assessing things. So the encircling circles don't affect their judgment as much. And the basic idea behind this hypothesis is that people in weird societies are constantly assessing things across different types of contexts. And because we're so used to doing it, it leads to illusions in certain cases. Whereas people in remote villages, they're not exposed to that type of comparative activity as much. And so they don't have the same kind of tendency to really be taken in by the holistic context in which the things are presented to them. Okay, so what's the point of all of this? Well, the idea is we can't draw conclusions about human nature by studying undergrads at research universities. That's the simplistic claim, and it's a pretty powerful argument that's made for it in this paper. The sort of more philosophically significant claim that I wanted to run by you is this idea that to achieve objectivity, to think of objectivity as a social achievement, we not only need to diversify our research communities for the reasons that we talked about last week, but we also need to study diverse populations. Because even if the research community is extremely diverse, if we don't make an effort to study diverse populations, we will still get a skewed picture of humanity, and what we think is an objective account of human nature will be a really distorted one, maybe even a weird one. If you're interested in this kind of research, Henrik, his paper was so famous, he actually wrote a popular book about this research. It's a really fun read. I recommend it if you're interested in this kind of thing.